The rope cut into Elena's wrists as 3 men dragged her through the wet grass toward the tree line. She twisted against their grip, her bare feet slipping on the mud, but it made no difference. Behind her, the whole village stood watching in silence, holding torches that flickered against the darkening sky. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody said a word. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "Please, Edgar, you cannot do this." Edgar Voss, the man who had led the village council for 11 years, did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the black wall of trees ahead, his jaw tight, his hands folded behind his back like a man attending a funeral rather than a killing. "The pact must be honored," he said. "It has always been honored. One life given, and the rest of us live in peace for another year." "I have done nothing wrong," Elena said. "Why me? Why does it have to be me?" Nobody answered. That was the worst part. The silence. She searched the crowd for a familiar face. Someone who might step forward. Someone who might argue on her behalf. She found Nora, her closest friend since childhood, standing near the back with tears streaming down her face. But even Nora did not move. Even Nora stayed rooted to the spot, her hand pressed over her mouth. The men pulling her did not slow down. Their names were Colin and Garrick, 2 brothers who had grown up 2 houses down from her own. Boys she had once shared bread with at the village well. Now their faces were blank, emptied of anything she recognized. They had a job to do, and grief was not part of it. The forest ahead of them was known by a different name than the maps used. The villagers simply called it the Dark Line, because nothing that walked past the tree line ever fully came back the same. For 3 generations, since the founding of the settlement in the high valley beneath the northern mountains, something had lived in those woods. Something the elders called the Beast. Nobody had seen it clearly and lived to describe its face. What they knew came from broken stories, half-whispered warnings, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from father to son. It was said to be larger than any bear, faster than any wolf, and older than the first stone laid in the village square. Once a year, when the harvest moon rose fat and orange over the mountain ridge, the beast would come close to the village fences, and its howl would echo through every home, rattling shutters and silencing children. The tradition began, so the story went, after a terrible winter 3 generations ago, when the beast had torn through the livestock pens and left half the village without food before the first snow fell. The elders of that time had gone into the forest with an offering, begging for mercy, and in the morning, the attacks had stopped. Since then, the ritual had never been broken. One person, chosen by lottery or by decision of the council, given to the woods before the first frost. In exchange, the beast left the rest of the village alone for another full year. Elena had grown up hearing the story as a warning to behave, a threat murmured by parents to children who wandered too close to the fence line after dark. She had never truly believed she would become the offering herself. She had no husband, no children, no parents left living to fight for her. Her mother had died of fever 2 winters past, and her father had been lost at sea before she was old enough to remember his face clearly. She was, in the eyes of the council, expendable. A name easy to remove from the record without consequence. They reached the edge of the trees, where an ancient flat stone sat half buried in the earth, worn smooth by decades of rain and use. Elena had seen this stone before, from a distance, always avoiding it the way one avoids a grave. Now she stood before it, and Colin forced her down onto her knees, while Garrick tied her wrists to an iron ring, hammered into the rock centuries ago. "I am sorry," Colin muttered under his breath, so quiet that only she could hear it. There was no other way. "There is always another way," she whispered back, but he had already turned and was walking toward the torches, toward the safety of the crowd, toward the warm homes, where doors would soon be bolted shut for the night. Edgar approached last. He set a small woven basket beside her, containing bread, a skin of water, and a single white candle, as if these things could soften what he was about to do. "The beast prefers those who come without struggle," he said. "Do not fight it. Do not run. If you accept your place quietly, it may be swift." Elena stared at him, disbelief mixing with a fury she had never felt before in her life. "You speak as if you are doing me a kindness." "I am doing what must be done to keep 400 people alive," Edgar said, and for one brief moment, something almost like regret passed over his weathered face. Then it was gone, replaced by the same stone composure he wore during council meetings. "The sun will set soon. We must go." He turned and walked back toward the village, and the others followed, torches bobbing away into the distance, like fireflies retreating into the dark. Within minutes, Elena was alone at the tree line, tied to a rock older than memory, the forest looming black and silent in front of her, the village fading behind her, until even the torchlight disappeared over the ridge. She pulled against the rope, testing the iron ring, but it did not budge. Her wrists burned raw within minutes. The sky above her deepened from orange to purple, to a deep bruised black, and one by one, stars appeared over the mountain peaks, indifferent to her fear. The forest made sounds she had never noticed before, the creak of branches shifting in a wind she could not feel. The rustle of something moving through fallen leaves, far off, then closer, then far off again, as if circling. An owl called twice, and then went silent. Elena's breathing grew shallow, her heartbeat loud in her own ears, and she found herself praying to a God she was not certain existed, asking for a mercy she did not expect to receive. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. The candle Edgar had left beside her flickered out on its own, though she had not lit it. Cold crept up from the ground into her knees, into her spine, into the marrow of her bones. And she began to shiver, and with the shivering came a strange, exhausted calm, the kind that settles over a person once fear has nowhere left to go. It was near what she guessed to be midnight when she first heard the footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, each one landing with a weight that made the ground itself seem to shift slightly beneath her knees. Branches snapped somewhere to her left, then to her right, as though whatever moved through the trees was pacing around her in a wide, unhurried circle, taking its time, studying her the way a hunter studies prey, before deciding how to approach it. Elena froze completely. She did not dare turn her head. Every instinct told her that if she looked, she would see something her mind would never recover from. A low sound rolled out of the darkness, not quite a growl, not quite a breath, something in between, deep and resonant, vibrating through the cold night air. It was close now. Close enough that she could hear something enormous breathing, slow and steady, somewhere just beyond the reach of the moonlight filtering through the canopy. "Please," she whispered, not even sure if she meant it as a prayer, or as a plea, directed at the thing circling her. "Please, if you can understand me, I never asked to be brought here. I have never done anything to you." The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing, no sound at all, not even the wind. Elena held her breath, straining to hear anything, and then, so close behind her that she felt warmth against the back of her neck, she heard it breathe out, long and slow, almost like a sigh. She braced herself, certain this was the moment, certain that teeth or claws would come next, certain that her short, unremarkable life was about to end, tied to a stone at the edge of a forest that had swallowed dozens before her. She squeezed her eyes shut. Instead, she felt something impossibly gentle brush against the rope binding her wrists. A pressure, careful and controlled, working at the knot rather than tearing through it. Within seconds, the rope loosened and fell away, and her hands, numb and raw, dropped free into her lap. Elena did not move. She did not understand what had just happened, and some deep animal part of her brain screamed that this was worse, somehow, than a quick end. To be freed only to be toyed with, to be given false hope before the real horror began. But nothing came. No attack, no teeth, only silence, and the sense, impossible to explain, that whatever stood behind her was simply watching, waiting, as if it too did not fully know what to do next. Slowly, carefully, she turned her head. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs entirely. A shape towered above her, easily twice her height, outlined against the pale moonlight that broke through the canopy in scattered patches. It stood on two legs, though its posture was not quite human, shoulders broad and heavy, arms long and corded with muscle, beneath a coat of dark fur that seemed to drink in the surrounding shadows rather than reflect them. Its head was shaped somewhere between wolf and man, with a long jaw and sharp ears that swiveled slightly at the sound of her breathing, but its eyes, when they met hers, were unmistakably intelligent. golden, deep, and startlingly aware. Elena's entire body locked in place, frozen between the urge to run and the certainty that running would accomplish nothing against something so large. And the creature did not lunge. It did not snarl or bare its teeth. Instead, it simply lowered itself slightly, bringing its massive head down closer to her level, studying her with an intensity that felt less like a predator sizing up a meal, and more like someone trying to solve a puzzle they had encountered many times before but never quite understood. "You are the beast," she breathed, barely a whisper. A low sound rumbled from its chest, and though it was not language, not exactly, Elena had the strangest sense that it was almost a response, almost an acknowledgement. It took a step back from her, giving her space, and gestured with one clawed hand toward the deeper darkness of the forest, then back toward the direction of the village, as if offering her a choice. Elena's mind raced. She could run, back toward the fence line, back toward Edgar and Colin and Garrick and the people who had tied her to a rock and left her to die, or she could follow the very thing the entire village had spent generations fearing, the thing that was supposed to devour her before sunrise. Neither option made sense. Neither option felt safe. But the creature was not attacking her. It had freed her hands. It was waiting, patient in a way that unsettled her more than aggression would have, as though it had done this before, as though it understood exactly how terrified she was, and had no interest in making that terror worse. "Why did you untie me?" she asked, her voice trembling, but steadier than she expected. "If you are going to hurt me, why not just do it?" The creature tilted its massive head, and for one strange, suspended moment, Elena could have sworn she saw something like sorrow pass through those golden eyes. Then it turned, taking several slow steps into the trees, pausing after a short distance to look back at her, as if checking whether she would follow. Elena glanced over her shoulder, back toward the direction of the village, where warm lights glowed faintly over the distant ridge. She thought of Edgar's blank composure, of Colin's whispered apology that meant nothing in the end, of the crowd that had watched her dragged away without a single voice raised in protest. She thought of Nora's tears, useless against the will of the council. Nothing waited for her back there except people who had already decided she was worth less than their own peace of mind. She looked back at the creature, still waiting patiently a short distance into the trees, its golden eyes steady and calm despite everything the stories had told her to expect. With her heart hammering against her ribs, and every rational instinct screaming at her to run in the opposite direction, Elena rose slowly from the ground, her legs weak beneath her, and took her first uncertain step into the dark line. The creature did not rush her. It matched its pace to hers, staying just ahead, glancing back every so often to ensure she was still there, still following, still safe. The forest around them was thick and old, trees so tall their tops disappeared into a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight, leaving only thin silver threads of light scattered across the forest floor. Elena stumbled more than once over roots and stones hidden beneath fallen leaves, and each time, the creature paused, waiting without impatience, until she found her footing again. It never touched her, never pushed her forward, never once made a sound that resembled a threat. The longer they walked, the more her fear began to shift into something else entirely, something closer to confusion. Everything she had been taught about this creature, every warning whispered by candlelight, every nightmare shaped by decades of fearful storytelling, suggested she should already be dead. Instead, she was walking deeper into the woods, beside the very thing meant to kill her, and it was behaving less like a monster, and more like a reluctant guide, leading a lost traveler home. They walked for what felt like an hour, maybe longer, the sounds of the forest shifting around them, owls calling from unseen branches, small animals scattering at their approach, a stream babbling somewhere in the distance growing steadily louder as they moved toward it. Eventually, the trees began to thin slightly, opening into a small clearing where moonlight fell more freely, illuminating the entrance to what appeared to be a cave built into the base of a rocky hillside, half hidden behind curtains of hanging vines and moss. The creature stopped at the entrance and turned to face her fully for the first time since they had begun walking. Up close, in the open moonlight, Elena could see details she had missed before, scars crossing its shoulder and along one side of its ribs, old wounds that had healed poorly, as if tended by no one. Its breathing was steady, but there was an exhaustion in the set of its shoulders that had nothing to do with the walk they had just taken, an exhaustion that seemed to run far deeper, worn into it over years, perhaps longer. Elena stood at the edge of the clearing, uncertain whether to step closer or hold her ground, her mind still struggling to reconcile the monster of the village stories with the creature standing patiently before her, waiting once again, always waiting, for a decision she alone could make. "What are you?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though she was no longer certain the question was one of fear. "What are you, really?" The creature did not answer, not in words, but it lowered itself slightly, settling onto the ground near the cave entrance, keeping a respectful distance between them, and simply watched her with those steady golden eyes, as though giving her all the time in the world to decide whether she trusted it enough to stay. Overhead, the harvest moon hung heavy and orange above the mountain ridge, exactly as it had every year for 3 generations, watching over a village that believed without question that the woman it had sacrificed was already gone. None of them could have imagined that instead of an ending, Elena had just stepped into the beginning of something none of the old stories had ever prepared her for. Elena did not sleep that first night, not fully. She sat near the mouth of the cave, wrapped in a coarse blanket the creature had dragged out from somewhere deep inside the rocky shelter, watching the fire it had somehow built from dry branches, and a spark struck between 2 stones held clumsily in claws never designed for such delicate work. The flames cast long shadows across the clearing, and every time a branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, her whole body tensed, ready to run, though she was not certain where she would run to. The creature sat across from her, on the far side of the fire, its huge frame folded down low to the ground, watching her with the same patient stillness it had shown since the moment it freed her wrists. It made no move to come closer. It made no sound, beyond the occasional low breath, deep and even, the kind of sound that might have been calming, had it come from anything smaller. "You're not going to hurt me," Elena said eventually, more to break the silence than because she expected an answer. "If you were going to, you would have done it already." The creature's ears flicked toward her, and it tilted its head slightly, the way she had seen dogs do when trying to understand a word they almost recognized. It did not answer, of course. It could not answer, not in any language she understood, but something about the gesture, so oddly familiar, so strangely gentle, eased a fraction of the tightness in her chest. She studied it more carefully now that the firelight gave her a clearer look. Beneath the thick dark fur and the powerful unnatural build, there was something in the shape of its face, in the structure of its jaw and the set of its brow, that reminded her uncomfortably of a man. Not fully human, not even close, but not entirely animal either. It existed somewhere in the space between the two, a space the village stories had never bothered to explain, because no one had ever gotten close enough to notice. "Do you have a name?" she asked, feeling foolish, even as the words left her mouth. She did not expect an answer, not really, but the creature's head lifted at the question, its golden eyes narrowing slightly, as though the question itself had stirred something buried deep inside it, something old and mostly forgotten. It opened its jaw, and for a moment, Elena thought it might actually attempt to speak, but what came out instead was a low, rough sound, more growl than word, though it seemed to carry the shape of something once meaningful. She caught only a fragment, something that might have been the beginning of a name, before the sound dissolved into a frustrated exhale, and the creature looked away toward the fire, its shoulders sagging with what looked unmistakably like disappointment. "It's all right," Elena said quietly, surprising herself with the softness in her own voice. "You don't have to try right now." They sat like that for a long while, the fire crackling between them, the forest breathing its quiet nighttime sounds around the clearing. Exhaustion eventually pulled Elena down into an uneasy sleep, her back against the cool stone of the cave entrance, and when she woke hours later, gray morning light filtering weakly through the canopy above, she found the creature had not moved from its spot across the dead fire, still watching her, as if it had stayed awake the entire night, simply to make sure she remained safe. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Elena did not attempt to leave, not because she believed she could not, but because each time she considered it, she remembered the blank faces of the village, the silence when she had begged for help, the ease with which Edgar had spoken of her life as a debt to be paid. There was nothing waiting for her back there, except the same fate repeated in different clothing, at some future harvest, when the council decided someone else's life was expendable too. The creature, she began to notice, left the cave each morning while she slept, and returned before she woke, always with something useful. A handful of berries she did not recognize but that turned out to be sweet and safe to eat. Fresh water carried in a hollowed gourd. Once, a small woven basket, clearly old and clumsily repaired, containing dried meat that must have come from some abandoned trapper's cache deep in the woods. It was providing for her, in its own limited way, the same way it had freed her hands, instead of ending her life at the stone altar. On the third day, Elena worked up the courage to follow it partway into the forest, instead of waiting at the cave. The creature noticed almost immediately, turning back with an expression she was beginning to learn to read, something between surprise and quiet approval. It slowed its pace to match hers again, the way it had on their first night together, and led her not deeper into danger, but toward a wide, clear stream, cutting through a rocky ravine, where fish moved beneath the surface in flashes of silver. It was there, kneeling beside the water, that Elena first saw it hesitate, before catching a fish with a swift, practiced motion of one clawed hand, only to pause and offer the fish to her first, waiting until she had taken her share before eating anything itself. "You didn't have to do that," she said, turning the fish over in her hands. "You caught it. You should eat first." The creature made a low sound, almost dismissive, and gestured toward her with an open palm, insistent, until she finally understood it wanted her to eat without argument. She did, and it watched her the entire time with something that looked almost like satisfaction, the way a person might feel after finally succeeding at a task they had failed many times before. It was during these quiet moments, over the following days, that Elena slowly began piecing together fragments of understanding about the creature that had once terrified an entire village. It never attacked anything unless threatened first, and even then, its response was measured, controlled, nothing like the reckless violence the old stories described. It avoided the parts of the forest closest to the village fence, as though it understood, better than anyone, the fear its presence caused, and chose, deliberately, to keep its distance. And every night, without fail, it built a fire for her before the sun fully set, always positioning itself between her and the darkest part of the trees, a silent, watchful guard against threats she could not see, and it apparently could. One evening, nearly a week after she had first been left at the stone altar, Elena worked up the nerve to ask the question that had been sitting heavy in her chest since that first night. "Why didn't you kill me?" she asked, watching the fire rather than the creature's face, unsure she could bear to see its reaction. "Everyone in the village believes that's what happens. That's the whole reason for the offering, so why am I still here?" The creature was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Elena began to think it would not, or could not, respond at all. Then it rose slowly from its place across the fire, and moved closer than it had ever come before, lowering itself down beside her rather than across from her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from its massive frame. It lifted one clawed hand, moving with a deliberate carefulness that seemed almost impossible for something built with such raw strength, and gently touched its own chest, then gestured toward her, then back to itself again. Elena watched the gesture, trying to understand. "You're saying you wouldn't. You never would." She looked up at it then, searching its golden eyes for confirmation. "You've never actually hurt any of the people the village sent out here, have you?" The creature held her gaze, unmoving, and something in its expression, some deep and ancient weariness, told her the answer, before it made any further gesture at all. It shook its head slowly, once, a motion so human in its simplicity that it sent a chill down Elena's spine that had nothing to do with the cold night air. "Then what happens to them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "All the people who were brought here before me, where are they?" The creature turned its head toward the deeper woods, beyond the ravine, beyond the reach of the firelight, and Elena understood, without needing further explanation, that there was an answer out there, somewhere in the dark, and that whatever it was, it would take more than one conversation by firelight for her to fully understand it. For now she was alive, she was fed, and sheltered, and, strange as it felt to admit even silently to herself, she was safer in that clearing beside a creature the entire village believed to be a monster than she had ever felt standing among the people who called themselves her neighbors. As the fire burned low and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, Elena found herself, for the first time since she had been dragged from her home, no longer thinking about how to escape the forest, but instead wondering what other truths waited to be uncovered within it, and what kind of person, or creature, had been left alone out here for so long, that an act of simple kindness could leave it looking as surprised and grateful as it had over a shared meal of fish beside a quiet stream. The wind shifted through the trees, carrying with it the distant, mournful call of some night bird, and beside her, close enough now that she could hear the steady rhythm of its breathing, the creature that was supposed to be her death instead settled in to keep watch over her through another long night, exactly as it had every night since it had chosen, against every expectation carved into generations of fearful stories, to let her live. The change happened for the first time nearly 2 weeks after Elena had come to the forest, and it happened without warning, in the gray hour just before dawn, while she was still half asleep beneath the blanket near the dying embers of the fire. She woke to a sound unlike anything she had heard before, low and strained, almost pained, coming from somewhere near the cave entrance. She sat up quickly, heart hammering, expecting danger, some new threat that had finally found its way into the clearing. Instead, she saw the creature curled in on itself at the edge of the firelight, its massive body shuddering, its breathing ragged and uneven, as though it were fighting against something happening from the inside. "What's wrong?" Elena said, scrambling to her feet, unsure whether to move closer or stay back. "Tell me what's happening." The creature did not answer, could not answer, caught in the grip of whatever was overtaking it. Its shape seemed to shift and blur at the edges, fur receding in patches, limbs contracting, and lengthening in ways that made Elena's stomach turn just to witness. And she wanted to look away. Every instinct told her to look away. But something kept her rooted in place, watching, as the massive form slowly, painfully, folded down into something smaller. By the time the sun crested the mountain ridge, casting the first pale light into the clearing, the creature was gone, and in its place, kneeling on the cold ground with his head bowed and his shoulders shaking, was a man. He was younger than she expected, though it was hard to guess his exact age with his face hidden behind a curtain of dark, matted hair. His skin was pale from years without proper sunlight, marked with the same scars she had noticed on the creature's shoulder and ribs, proof that whatever body he wore, the wounds carried over between them. He wore no clothing beyond a rough wrap of hide tied around his waist, clearly fashioned by his own hands out of necessity, rather than any concern for modesty. Elena stood frozen, unsure whether to approach or give him space, until he finally lifted his head and looked at her, and she saw, for the first time, the same golden eyes that had watched her so carefully every night since her rescue, now set into an unmistakably human face. "You can speak," she said quietly, the realization settling over her slowly. "In this form, you can actually speak." His voice, when it finally came, was rough from disuse, cracked, like old leather, left too long in the sun. "It has been a long time," he said, each word deliberate, as though he had to relearn the shape of speech with every syllable, "since anyone has heard me say anything at all." "What's your name?" Elena asked, kneeling down a careful distance away, giving him the same space he had always given her. He was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his own hands as though they belonged to a stranger. "Cade," he finally said. "My name is Cade." Over the following days, as Cade grew more accustomed to speaking again, and as Elena grew more accustomed to the strange rhythm of his transformations, which occurred each dawn and reversed again each dusk, the story of what had happened to him slowly emerged, piece by piece, like a wound being carefully unwrapped after years of neglect. He had once lived among people, in a village not unlike the one Elena had grown up in, though it had stood in a different valley, further south, long before the current settlement had even been founded. He had been the son of a healer, trained from a young age in the use of herbs and remedies, respected among his neighbors for his steady hands and quiet patience. The curse, as he understood it, had come from an old woman who lived at the edge of that village, a woman most people avoided out of superstition and unease. She had come to his family seeking treatment for an illness no remedy could touch, and though Cade had done everything within his skill to ease her suffering, she had died regardless, as was inevitable given the severity of her condition. Her family, grieving and desperate to place blame somewhere, had accused Cade of failing her deliberately, of withholding a cure out of some imagined grudge. The accusation had spread through the village like fire through dry grass, fed by fear and old prejudice against his family's isolated way of living. Within a month, the same people who had once brought their children to his father for healing had turned against him entirely. And one night, a group of men, led by the dead woman's own son, had dragged him into the surrounding forest and left him for whatever wild animals might find him first. "I should have died that night," Cade said, staring into the fire, his voice flat with the particular exhaustion of someone who had told himself this story too many times to feel much of anything about it anymore. But something else found me instead. Something old, something that had lived in those woods long before my village existed. It changed me. I do not fully understand how, or why. I only know that I woke 3 days later in a body that was no longer entirely my own, and I have carried both forms ever since. "And you ended up here," Elena said softly. "In this forest, near my village." Cade nodded. "I wandered for a long time before I found this place. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that somewhere far from where the curse began, I might find a way to live quietly, without harming anyone, without being found. Instead, I found a new village had built itself along the edge of these woods, and instead of driving me away, they decided I was something to be feared, something to be appeased." His jaw tightened. "And every year, they have sent someone into these trees, believing I required a life, in exchange for leaving them in peace." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach, and none of them ever came back. "No," Cade said quietly, "not because I hurt them. I have never once harmed anyone. Your people sent into this forest." He looked up at her then, his golden eyes steady despite the pain clearly written across the rest of his face. "But the forest itself is not always kind, even when I am. Some I found too late, lost to the cold, or to creatures far less patient than I am. Others I managed to guide safely to the far side of the mountains, to villages that had never heard the stories your people tell, where they could begin new lives without ever needing to explain where they had come from." "You saved them," Elena said, the realization washing over her slowly. "All this time, everyone believed you were devouring the people the village sent out here, and you were actually trying to save them." "Not all of them," Cade admitted, and something in his voice cracked slightly, an old grief resurfacing. "I was not always fast enough. I was not always strong enough to fight off what else lives in these woods. I have carried that weight for a very long time, Elena. Every person I failed to save, every name, I never learned before it was too late." Elena reached out then, slowly, and rested her hand against his forearm, the first time she had willingly touched him in either form. He flinched slightly at the contact, as though unused to gentleness, but did not pull away. "You didn't fail me," she said quietly. "You found me in time." Cade looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his golden eyes, some old wall beginning to crack under the weight of her simple kindness. "I am glad of that," he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion he seemed unwilling to name. "More glad than I know how to properly say." As the days passed and Cade's story settled more fully into her understanding, Elena found herself looking at the forest differently, no longer as a place of death and dread, but as a place where a wronged man had spent years alone, carrying guilt for failures that were never truly his to bear, quietly working to undo the damage caused by a tradition built on fear rather than truth. She began to understand, too, the particular loneliness that had shaped him, the way years of isolation had worn down his ability to trust, to speak, to believe that kindness offered to him was not simply the prelude to another betrayal. And slowly, carefully, day by day, she found herself determined to prove to him that this time would be different. The nights grew colder as autumn deepened further into the mountains, and each evening, as the sun set and Cade's body shifted back into the massive, powerful form the village so feared, Elena no longer felt the tightening grip of terror she had once carried. Instead, she felt something closer to comfort, knowing that whichever form he wore, the man underneath, the healer's son who had once tended to the sick with steady, patient hands, remained exactly the same. The first frost of the season arrived quietly one morning, coating the clearing in a thin layer of silver that crunched beneath Elena's feet as she stepped outside the cave to gather water from the stream. She had grown used to the rhythm of this life now, the daily routine that once would have seemed impossible to imagine. Mornings belonged to Cade in his human form, hours where they spoke freely, where he taught her things she had never learned in the village, and evenings belonged to the beast, when he kept his silent, watchful guard over her through the darkness. "You're doing it wrong," Cade said, watching her attempt to start a fire with the flint stones he had shown her the day before. His voice carried a warmth now that had not been there in those first uncertain days, an ease that came from weeks of practice speaking again after years of silence. "You're striking too hard. It needs a lighter touch, closer to the tinder." Elena huffed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You make it look easy because you've had years to practice. I've had 4 days. Then you have years ahead of you to get better," he said, and there was something almost like teasing in his tone, a lightness she had not expected to find in a man who carried so much old grief. He knelt beside her, guiding her hands with his own, careful and deliberate the way he always was, and after a few more attempts, a small spark finally caught in the dry moss she had gathered. "There," he said, satisfaction clear in his voice as the flame grew steadily. "You'll have no trouble managing on your own now." Elena sat back on her heels, watching the fire take hold, feeling a small swell of pride she had not expected to feel over something as simple as starting a flame. "Why does it matter so much to you?" she asked, glancing up at him. "That I learned to survive out here on my own. You already do so much for me." Cade was quiet for a moment, his golden eyes, the same in either form, fixed thoughtfully on the fire between them. "Because I will not always be able to protect you," he said finally. "There may come a day when I cannot reach you in time, when the sun has not yet set, and my other form has not yet returned, and you will need to know how to care for yourself until I can." He paused, something heavier settling into his expression. "I have already failed to reach people in time before, Elena. I do not intend to fail again, but I would rather you never depend entirely on my ability to save you." The honesty in his words settled something warm and unfamiliar in Elena's chest, an ache that was not quite sadness, and not quite anything she had a name for. In the village, she had never been anyone's particular concern. She had grown used to being overlooked, to managing on her own, because no one else thought to offer help, unless it benefited them directly. Here, in a forest everyone believed to be a place of death, she had found someone who thought carefully, deliberately, about her survival even beyond his own presence. Over the following weeks, their days settled into a comfortable pattern, each one building on the last. Cade taught her which plants were safe to eat, and which carried poison hidden behind pretty leaves, how to track the movement of deer through broken branches and disturbed earth, how to read the sky for coming weather long before the first clouds gathered. Elena, in turn, found small ways to care for him that he seemed unused to receiving, cleaning, and treating the old wounds along his shoulder that never quite healed properly, mending the simple hide clothing he wore during his human hours, and simply sitting with him in comfortable silence when words felt unnecessary. "You hum sometimes," Cade observed one evening, as she worked a needle fashioned from bone through a torn seam. "When you're concentrating on something. Did someone teach you that song?" Elena smiled faintly, not looking up from her work. "My mother used to sing it. I don't remember all the words anymore, just the tune. She died when I was young." She glanced up at him. "What about you? Did your mother sing?" Something flickered across Cade's face, old memory surfacing briefly before he pushed it back down. "She did," he said quietly. "A different song. I haven't thought of it in a very long time. Will you hum it for me sometime?" Elena asked, "if you remember it?" Cade looked at her for a long moment, something soft and unguarded passing behind his golden eyes. "Perhaps," he said, "when I am ready." As autumn deepened further and the nights grew longer, Elena noticed a change in herself that she had not expected. The constant fear that had gripped her those first nights had faded almost entirely, replaced by something steadier, something that felt, strangely, like belonging. She no longer flinched when Cade's massive beast form settled beside her each evening. She had learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture and the low sounds he made, understanding them now almost as clearly as words. One particularly cold night, as they sat close together near the fire, Elena found herself studying the scars along his shoulder in the flickering light. "Does it hurt?" she asked quietly, changing every day, back and forth. "I've watched it happen so many times now, and it still looks like it causes you pain." Cade, in his beast form, made a low sound that had come to mean something close to acknowledgement. He shifted slightly, angling his massive head so their eyes met directly. The pain was there. She had seen it clearly enough during those gray dawn and dusk hours when his body folded and stretched between shapes. But he had never once complained of it, never used it as an excuse for anything. "I'm sorry you have to carry that," she said softly, reaching out to rest her hand gently against the thick fur of his arm, a gesture that had become natural between them over the passing weeks. "I wish there was something I could do to ease it." The beast lowered his massive head slowly until it rested, with surprising gentleness, against her shoulder, a silent response that said more than words could have managed. Elena sat still, letting the weight of his trust settle over her, and felt, for the first time since she had been dragged from her home weeks earlier, something close to peace. It was during these quiet weeks that Elena began to understand something the village had never taught her, something the old fearful stories had gotten entirely wrong. The beast the villagers so dreaded was not a monster to be appeased through sacrifice. He was a wronged man, cursed through no fault of his own, who had spent years alone in these woods carrying grief and guilt that were never rightfully his to bear, quietly working against impossible odds to save the very people who feared him. And somewhere in the space between his two forms, in the careful patience of his teaching and the steady warmth of his protection, Elena found herself caring for him in a way she had never expected to care for anyone, let alone a man the entire world believed to be a beast. One crisp morning, as golden light broke over the mountain ridge, and Cade knelt by the stream in his human form, quietly humming a tune Elena did not recognize, low and unfamiliar but achingly gentle, she realized she had stopped counting the days since her sacrifice. She no longer measured her time in the forest by how long it had been since she left the village behind. Instead, she measured it by moments like this one, quiet mornings, shared with a man who had shown her more genuine care in a few short weeks than her own people had offered in a lifetime. She did not know yet what the future held, whether the village would ever discover she still lived, whether the old tradition that had nearly claimed her life would ever be challenged or broken. But for the first time since the rope had been cut from her wrists at that ancient stone altar, Elena felt something steady beneath her uncertainty, a sense that whatever came next, she would not face it alone, and neither, any longer, would Cade. It was Cade who first suggested showing her the far side of the ravine, a place he had avoided taking her before, though he never explained why, until the morning he finally led her there himself, his expression unusually solemn as they walked. "There is something you should see," he said, his human voice quiet, as they made their way along a narrow trail she had not noticed before, hidden behind a curtain of thick brush at the edge of the clearing. "I have hesitated to bring you here, but I think it is time you understood the full weight of what your village has done, not only to you, but to others before you." They walked for nearly an hour, deeper into a part of the forest Elena had never explored, until the trees opened into a small, quiet hollow, surrounded by moss-covered stones. Scattered throughout the clearing were simple markers, some made of stacked rocks, others carved crudely into wood, each one clearly placed with care despite their rough construction. "What is this place?" Elena asked, though some part of her already understood. "Every person your village has sent into these woods over the years, I have tried to account for," Cade said quietly, moving to stand beside one of the markers, his hand resting gently against the weathered wood. "Those I managed to save, I guided safely across the mountains, to villages far from here, where they could build new lives. But not all of them survived the journey, or the forest itself, before I could reach them in time." He paused, grief etched plainly across his face. "This is where I lay them to rest. It felt wrong to leave them forgotten, especially when your people have already forgotten them so easily themselves." Elena moved slowly through the hollow, reading the crude names carved into some of the markers, names she recognized from stories told in hushed voices back in the village, people spoken of only as cautionary tales, warnings about what happened to those unlucky enough to be chosen. She had never once heard anyone speak of them as people who had been mourned, who had names, who had lives worth remembering beyond their use as an offering. "How many?" she asked quietly, though she was not certain she wanted the answer. "More than I would like to admit," Cade said. "The tradition is older than either of us, Elena. It began long before I arrived in these woods, and I suspect it began for reasons that had little to do with any actual threat I posed. He turned to face her fully. I have wondered for years why your council insists on continuing a practice that accomplishes nothing, except removing people they find inconvenient. I believe I finally understand why, and I think you deserve to know as well. He led her further, to a smaller structure, hidden behind a rock face, clearly built by human hands long ago and long abandoned, half collapsed under the weight of years of neglect. Inside, protected somewhat from the elements, Elena found old ledgers, their pages brittle and yellowed, filled with careful handwriting that recorded names, dates, and brief notes beside each entry. I found this shelter many years ago, Kate explained, watching her carefully as she paged through the fragile records. I believe it once belonged to someone connected to your village's founding council, someone who kept records they did not wish to keep within the village itself. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she read through entry after entry, and slowly, the true pattern began to emerge, clear and undeniable, despite the passage of years. The names chosen for the yearly offering were rarely selected by fair lottery, as the villagers had always been told. Instead, the ledger revealed a careful, deliberate pattern. Those chosen were almost always people who had challenged the council's authority in some way, who had voiced disagreement during meetings, who had inconvenient debts, who had no family influential enough to protest, or who simply knew something the council preferred to keep buried. Her own name appeared near the final pages, added in a hand she recognized immediately as Edgar's own precise script, alongside a brief note that made her stomach turn cold. No family remaining to raise objection. Suitable candidate for this season's tribute. They didn't choose me because tradition demanded it, Elena said slowly, the full weight of the betrayal settling over her. They chose me because it was convenient, because no one would fight for me. I am sorry, Cade said quietly, watching the anger and grief play across her face. I debated for a long time whether to show you this. I did not want to add to the pain you already carry, but I believe you deserve to know the truth, even when the truth is difficult. Elena sat down heavily on a fallen log, the ledger still clutched in her hands, and for a long moment, she said nothing at all, simply staring at the pages filled with names that had once meant nothing to her, names she now understood belonged to people discarded for the crime of being inconvenient to a handful of powerful men. The beast was never the real danger, she said finally, her voice hollow. It was always them. The council used your existence, used the fear surrounding you, to remove anyone who threatened their control over the village. And every year, they let the entire settlement believe they were making a necessary sacrifice, when really, they were simply disposing of problems. I believe that is precisely what has happened, Cade said. I have suspected it for a long time, watching the pattern of who was sent into these woods each year. Rarely the wealthy, rarely those connected to the council by blood or marriage, almost always those with no one left to speak on their behalf. Elena thought of Nora, standing helplessly at the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down her face, powerless to intervene, because speaking against the council carried its own dangerous risk. She thought of Colin's whispered apology, the guilt clearly written across his face, even as he followed orders he clearly did not agree with. How many others in the village felt the same quiet unease, the same suspicion that something about the tradition did not sit right, yet said nothing out of fear of becoming the next name added to that ledger? They need to know, Elena said, standing abruptly, the ledger still gripped tightly in her hands. The whole village needs to see this. They need to understand what Edgar and the council have actually been doing all these years. Cade's expression grew troubled. Elena, if you return to the village, even to expose the truth, you place yourself in tremendous danger. Edgar will not simply allow you to unravel a tradition that has protected his authority for years. He will see you as a far greater threat alive than he ever intended you to be as an offering. I understand that, Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly at the thought. But if I stay hidden here forever, nothing changes. Someone else will be chosen next season, and the season after that, and the truth will remain buried in this abandoned shelter, where no one will ever find it. She looked up at him, determination steadying her voice, despite the fear still coursing beneath it. I can't let that happen. Not now that I know. Cade studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his instinct to protect her from harm, and his understanding that she was right. that the truth deserved to be brought into the light, regardless of the risk involved. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Then you will not face them alone," he said. "Whatever comes, I will stand beside you." "They're terrified of you," Elena reminded him gently. "If you come with me, they may react with violence before anyone has the chance to hear the truth at all. Then perhaps it is time they learned they have spent generations being terrified of the wrong thing entirely," Cade said, his golden eyes hardening with a resolve Elena had not seen from him before. "I have spent years alone in these woods, carrying guilt for failures that were never truly mine, protecting people who believed me to be their greatest danger. I am done hiding from a fear built entirely on lies." As the sun began its slow descent toward the mountain ridge, casting long shadows across the quiet hollow filled with forgotten graves, Elena tucked the fragile ledger carefully into the fold of her cloak, its brittle pages holding within them the proof that would finally, after generations of silence, challenge everything her village believed to be true. Whatever came next, whatever danger waited for them both when they finally stepped back across that fence line, she would not turn away from it now. Too many names in that ledger deserved better than the silence that had buried them for so long, and she would not let her own name become just another entry forgotten in an old and abandoned shelter, hidden from the truth it deserved to reveal. They waited 3 more days before making their move, days Cade spent teaching Elena the safest route back toward the village, one that avoided the areas of the forest where the ground grew unstable near the ravine's edge. On the morning they finally set out, the sky hung heavy with pale clouds, and a cold wind swept down from the mountain peaks, carrying with it the first true bite of the coming winter. "You don't have to come all the way to the fence line," Elena said, glancing at Cade as they walked, his human form steady beside her, the ledger secured carefully within a satchel he had fashioned for her from worn leather. "If they see you before they hear the truth, they may panic. I will stay near the tree line until you need me," Cade said, "but I will not let you face them entirely alone. Not after everything they have already done." His jaw was set with quiet determination, though Elena did not miss the tension in his shoulders, the old caution of a man who had learned, through painful experience, how quickly fear could turn into violence. By midday, they reached the edge of the forest, the familiar fence line of the village, visible through the thinning trees, smoke rising lazily from several chimneys in the distance. Elena's heart pounded as she stepped out from beneath the canopy, the open field between the forest and the village, stretching before her like a threshold she had never expected to cross again. It did not take long before she was noticed. A young boy tending sheep near the fence spotted her first, his eyes going wide with disbelief, before he turned and sprinted toward the village, shouting words Elena could not quite make out, but understood immediately. Within minutes, a crowd began gathering at the fence line, drawn by the impossible sight of a woman everyone believed had been consumed by the beast weeks earlier, walking calmly out of the forest very much alive. Nora reached her first, pushing through the gathering crowd with tears already streaming down her face, pulling Elena into a fierce embrace, before pulling back to study her, as though checking to make sure she was truly real, and not some cruel trick of grief-stricken imagination. "You're alive," Nora breathed. "We all believed. Edgar told everyone you were gone. How are you standing here?" "I need to speak with the whole village," Elena said, her voice carrying more strength than she felt. "All of them, Nora. This concerns everyone, not just me." The word spread through the settlement faster than Elena could have anticipated, and within the hour, most of the village had gathered in the central square, drawn by disbelief and curiosity in equal measure. Elena stood before them, the satchel containing the ledger held tightly against her side, and searched the crowd until she found Edgar's face, pale with shock, pushing his way toward the front of the gathering. "This is not possible," Edgar said, his composed authority visibly shaken for the first time Elena had ever witnessed. The offering was completed. The ritual was honored. "The ritual was never honored," Elena said, her voice steady, despite the trembling she felt beneath her calm exterior. "Because the ritual was never true. I have spent these past weeks in the forest, and I have learned things about our tradition that every person standing here deserves to know." She pulled the ledger from the satchel, holding it aloft for the crowd to see, and began to read aloud, her voice growing steadier with each entry, each name, each careful, damning note written in Edgar's own precise handwriting. She watched the faces around her shift, from disbelief to confusion, to a slow, dawning horror, as the pattern became undeniable. Name after name selected not by fair chance, but by careful calculation. Always those least able to protest. Always those most inconvenient to the council's authority. Lies, Edgar said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. Fabrications, meant to undermine the very tradition that has kept this village safe for generations. Then explain the handwriting, Edgar, Elena said, holding the final page toward him, the entry bearing her own name, written unmistakably in his script. Explain why my own selection was recorded as convenient rather than as fate, or chance, or the will of whatever force you claim demands this sacrifice each year. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, uncertainty and growing anger visible on faces that had, until this moment, accepted the council's authority, without serious question. Colin stepped forward from among the gathered villagers, his expression grim. I always wondered, he admitted quietly, loud enough for those nearby to hear, why it was never anyone from the council's own families, why it was always someone like Elena, someone with no one left to fight for them. The beast never demanded these sacrifices at all, Elena continued, raising her voice to carry across the growing unrest in the square. It never wanted them, never needed them, and never killed the people sent to it. I can prove that, because I am living proof myself, and there are others, still alive, guided safely across the mountains, by the very creature we have spent generations fearing. As if summoned by her words, a low, resonant sound rolled across the field, beyond the fence line, and the crowd turned as one, gasping and stumbling backward, as the massive form of the beast emerged from the tree line, standing tall and unmistakable at the edge of the forest, golden eyes fixed steadily on the frightened gathering. Panic rippled instantly through the crowd, several villagers scrambling for weapons, others simply fleeing toward their homes, and Elena felt her pulse spike with fear, not for herself, but for Cade, standing exposed and vulnerable, before an entire village primed by generations of terror, to see him as nothing but a monster to be destroyed. Stop, Elena shouted, moving quickly to place herself between the frightened crowd and the tree line. He has not moved to harm anyone. He will not, unless you force his hand through your own violence. Look at him. Truly look, and ask yourselves why, in 3 generations of this tradition, not a single person has ever actually witnessed him attack. The crowd hesitated, weapons half raised, fear and uncertainty warring visibly on every face. Cade remained still at the tree line, making no aggressive movement, his posture deliberately non-threatening despite his imposing size. And slowly, gradually, the initial panic began to settle into something closer to confused, wary curiosity. He saved me, Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the tense silence that had fallen over the square. The night I was tied to that stone and left for dead, he cut my bindings instead of harming me. He has fed me, sheltered me, and taught me to survive these past weeks, all while your council has been quietly disposing of anyone who threatened their control, using your fear of him as the perfect cover for their own cruelty. Edgar, sensing the crowd's mood shifting dangerously against him, took a step backward, his earlier composure crumbling entirely into something closer to desperation. You would trust the word of a beast over the leadership that has protected this village for generations, he said, though the strength had gone out of his voice, replaced by something closer to fear. I would trust the evidence written in your own hand, Edgar, Elena said, holding the ledger aloft once more. And I would trust the fact that I am standing here alive, speaking to all of you, when your tradition promised I would already be dead. The square fell into a heavy, uncertain silence, the crowd caught between decades of ingrained fear and the undeniable truth now laid bare before them. And at the edge of the tree line, patient and steady despite the danger surrounding him, Cade remained exactly where he stood, waiting, as he always had, to see whether the truth alone would finally be enough to change what generations of fear had built. It was Martha Bell, one of the older council members standing near the front of the crowd, who finally broke the silence, her weathered voice trembling, but clear enough to carry across the square. I want to see it, she said, stepping forward, despite Edgar's sharp look of warning. I want to see the rest of the ledger. All of it, not just the pages Elena has already shown us. Elena handed the fragile book to Martha without hesitation, watching as the older woman's hands shook while she turned through the brittle pages, her lips moving silently as she read entry after entry, name after name, the pattern of convenient disappearances laid bare in ink that had faded but never lied. "My sister," Martha said suddenly, her voice cracking. "My sister was sent to the beast 8 years ago, after she argued publicly against the council's decision to raise the grain taxes." She looked up, tears gathering in her eyes, fixed directly on Edgar. "You told me it was random selection. You told me the lottery chose her name fairly." Edgar said nothing, his silence more damning than any denial could have been. "Is she alive?" Martha asked, turning toward Elena, desperation evident in every line of her face. "Did the beast save her the way it saved you?" Elena glanced toward the tree line, where Cade still stood, watching the unfolding scene with careful attention. She did not know the answer, could not know it with certainty, but something in Cade's steady gaze told her he understood the question, even from a distance, and he gave a single, deliberate nod. "He says yes," Elena said, though her voice caught slightly with the weight of relief she felt on Martha's behalf. "He guided her across the mountains, the same as others before her. She is alive, living somewhere far from here, free of this village and everything it put her through." A sound broke from Martha then, somewhere between a sob and a laugh, relief and grief tangled together after 8 long years of believing her sister had been consumed by a monster that, in truth, had saved her life instead. The crowd's mood shifted further with each passing moment, murmurs of anger rising louder, directed now squarely at Edgar, and the council members standing uneasily near him. Colin stepped forward again, his voice steady, despite the anger visible in his expression. "How many of us have lost someone to this tradition?" he called out to the gathered crowd. "How many of us have grieved people the council simply decided were inconvenient to keep around?" One by one, voices rose from the crowd, names spoken aloud, grief and fury mixing together, as the true scope of the council's deception became undeniable to everyone present. Edgar attempted to speak again, some final defense of the tradition he had upheld for over a decade, but his words were lost beneath the rising anger of a village finally seeing clearly through the fear that had blinded them for generations. It was Garrick, one of the men who had helped bind Elena's wrists at the stone altar weeks earlier, who finally stepped forward from the crowd, his face pale but resolute. "I cannot undo what I have already done," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its unsteadiness. "But I will not stand beside this council for another moment." He turned toward Edgar directly. "The tradition ends today, and you will answer for every name in that ledger." The shift in the crowd's mood turned decisively then, and Edgar, recognizing the collapse of his authority, made a final desperate attempt to salvage control, gesturing sharply toward several of the younger men who had once enforced his decisions without question. "The beast is dangerous," he shouted, "regardless of what lies have been spread here today. It must be dealt with before it turns on this village entirely." But the men he called upon did not move, their loyalty to a tradition, built on lies already crumbling beneath the weight of everything they had just witnessed. Edgar stood alone in the center of the square, his authority stripped away entirely by the truth Elena had carried out of the forest, and slowly, he seemed to understand there was no path left for him to reclaim what he had lost. In the days that followed, the village council was dismantled entirely, replaced by a system that required open discussion and fair representation, rather than the quiet authority of a handful of powerful families. Edgar and the remaining council members who had known about the ledger's contents faced judgment before the newly formed assembly, and though Elena took no particular satisfaction in their downfall, she felt a deep and settled relief, knowing the tradition that had nearly claimed her life would never claim another. Cade remained at the edge of the forest during those turbulent weeks, watching from a careful distance as the village slowly rebuilt itself around a truth it had spent generations avoiding. Some villagers remained wary of him even after everything had been revealed, old fear not easily erased by a single confrontation, but others, particularly those who had lost someone to the tradition and learned they might still be alive somewhere beyond the mountains, began to see him differently, with a cautious gratitude that grew steadier with each passing day. Elena visited him each morning during those weeks, the walk between the village and the clearing becoming a familiar path she no longer feared, and each evening she returned to the forest to watch the sun set and his form shift back into the massive, powerful shape that no longer stirred anything in her except quiet affection and trust. You don't have to stay hidden in these woods any longer, she told him one crisp morning, as autumn gave way fully to the first true chill of winter. The village understands the truth now. You could walk among them, if you wished, without fear of what they might do. Cade considered this for a long moment, his golden eyes thoughtful, as he looked toward the distant rooftops visible beyond the tree line. Perhaps someday, he said. Trust rebuilds slowly, and I understand that better than most. But for now, I think I would rather remain here, in the place that has become my home, if you are willing to remain here with me. Elena smiled, reaching for his hand, human and warm in the morning light. I already have chosen to stay, she said simply. Not because I was forced into this forest, and not because I have nowhere else to go. I am here because this is where I want to be, beside you, exactly as I am. Cade's fingers tightened gently around hers, and for the first time since she had known him, she watched something like true peace settle fully across his features, the weariness that had lived so long behind his golden eyes, finally beginning to ease. Winter arrived in full soon after, blanketing the mountains in white, and the small clearing that had once been a place of fear and uncertainty became, instead, a place of quiet belonging for them both. Elena continued to visit the village regularly, watching it slowly transform into a community built on honesty rather than fear, while Cade began, cautiously and in his own time, to reconnect with a world that had once cast him out through no fault of his own. The story of the beast who refused to let her go spread slowly beyond the mountains, carried by those who had once been sent into the forest and lived to build new lives because of his quiet, patient kindness. And though the old fearful tales that had shaped generations would take time to fully fade, a new story began to take their place, one of a wronged man who had spent years alone, carrying grief that was never his to bear, and a woman who had walked willingly into the darkness he called home, and found, instead of the ending everyone expected, the beginning of everything that truly mattered.